Hello, and welcome to the eTech podcast with me, your host, Ryan Maughan. I have been involved in the development of electrified vehicles and machines since 2005 as an engineer and a business leader. This podcast is the product of my passion for electric and autonomous vehicle technology. I'm here to share knowledge from some of the world's leading experts, as well as my own insights. Join me as we accelerate the transition to cleaner, safer and smarter vehicles and grow the industry around the world. For today's episode, we've lined up something really interesting. It's something we get asked about all the time, and lots of our podcasts recently have touched on this in a small extent. But we thought we'd get in a real expert to talk to us about what's happening around the grid and all the challenges to do with adapting the grid as we make more and more electric vehicles on the road and more renewable energy into the system. So we've got with us today Russell Fowler. He comes from the National Grid company in the UK, so like literally the people who are responsible for this, and he's a project manager responsible for decarbonisation within the National Grid. So thanks for joining us, Russell.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me. Really happy to be here and really keen to talk about what you say here. Just if people are interested briefly in me. So yeah, I work for National Grid. If you don't know the company, you've probably heard of the National Grid. So basically, they're interchangeable terms, so don't worry too much about it. So it's basically, think about it as, I'm going to use a transport analogy, think about it as like the motorways of the electricity system. So the high voltage system, if you like. So taking the power from power stations and then taking it into the kind of the lower voltage, or like the B roads, if you like, and then taking it to your home. So National Grid doesn't take electricity to your home. We don't buy and sell electricity. We don't own power stations. We merely transfer it from power stations to the local grid and then to people's homes. So kind of a crucial step there. So we are in gas and electricity, so we have the same role in both there as well. So on me, so I've been looking at decarbonisation transport for officially as a full-time job, if you like, for around a year, but I have been looking at kind of future energy scenarios for kind of about 5-6 years before that, for looking at projections of electric vehicles and other forms of transport to see what effect they're going to have on the grid. So it's something we've been thinking about at National Grid for a very long time. So it's it's important that you have that point so you can build that into the your systems.
And what's a little bit about your sort of personal background? Where you know, how did you get into working for the National? What's your journey? You know, how did you get to do that?
What's my journey? That's a good question. So I, after university, like a lot of people, I'm thinking I need to find a job here. My background is mathematics, so I was looking for something that was going to kind of use those skills. And like a lot of people, I applied for a lot of jobs. I ended up working for a electricity retail business, and I was doing short-term forecasting. So how much electricity are we going to use the next day? How much are we going to use the day after? So that was really time at the coalface, if you like. I kind of relatively quickly found out, actually, that's really interesting, but I became really interested in the bits behind that. So, well, what drove that? So I kind of became a little bit more interested in the fundamentals and the strategy and long-term trends that sat behind the energy market. So I kind of moved out of the short-term business kind of into the long-term business. So eventually kind of ended up at National Grid, say looking at those long-term energy forecasts. So what is going to happen not over tomorrow, but what's going to happen over the next 10 years, the next 20 years. And that was really of interest to me. Yeah. So what is going to change in the power session? You talked about renewables there. So are we going to get to a point where we have 100% renewable system? When are we going to see electric cars, nothing but electric cars on the road and other bits like that? And then what's the so what of that? What does that mean for the electricity grid? What's going to have to happen, and what's going to need to happen for power, and what's going to happen for networks, and what's going to happen for people? So how are everyone going to change there? So I became kind of really interested in this. Then the opportunity to focus on transport came along, and it was absolutely, from my point of view, kind of no-brainer to go into this area and try and drive the uptake of electric vehicles.
That's fantastic. I can officially say you are the first mathematician that we've ever had on the podcast.
I'm honoured.
So you've got to fly the flag for that. So a lot of people know I'm as well as avid and the podcast and things, I'm completely passionate about STEM, but we often have the S, the T and the E, but finally the M made the full house. So brilliant.
There we go. That's fantastic. Great.
And you told us a bit about what National Grid is. So the sort of the backbone infrastructure. I guess the UK has got that kind of arrangement where, but it's not uncommon, is it? A lot of countries are organised in a similar way.
Yeah, so the way the electricity systems have just naturally developed, you often have this. You have what's called transmission that sits at the top, and then distribution at the bottom. So that's that voltage difference. So you're moving electricity over a relatively large distance, which a lot of countries will do. It makes sense to just the physics of this. Again, I'm not an E part of it, I'm the M part of it, but it's the most efficient way to move energy, and then you kind of step it down into your local area. So you'll see lots of grids around this. In Europe, you'll see this, you'll see transmission and distribution. You'll see that in the US. They don't have a whole grid. The country's far too large for that, so they have lots of separate grids as well. So it's a very common way to set up quite who owns and then who owns what, and precisely the politics, if you like, in between are slightly different and slightly different countries, but the basic setup, the basic principle is the same in kind of whatever country you look at.
Yeah, okay. And I guess you have to work kind of closely with government and with, because the energy generators are as separate to, and then you've
yes.
got, so there's a lot of stakeholders on your involved.
Yeah, that's a good, as I say, we are only interested and can legally by because we're heavily regulated because we're a monopoly. There's only one transmission system, so we can't be involved in selling it. We can't be involved in generating it. So absolutely right. So there's upstream stakeholders and there's downstream stakeholders as well. And of course, government sets the policy as well. Everyone responds to the policy setting as well. And of course, there's a regulator as well, Ofgem. So people know Ofgem from keeping people's energy bills low. They also regulate the whole market as well. So they make sure that we're charging a fair price for what we do, and we're and doing everything legally and above board as we should do as well. So there are absolutely a huge range of stakeholders there that we have to get involved with, and of course transport now is a new body of stakeholders that we're starting to engage with as well. Yeah,
all these pesky electric vehicles that are starting to come onto the road.
Indeed.
So really the sort of theme for this podcast started out with, we get asked a lot about grid, and people kind of raise this objection of, if electric cars, if everyone's driving an electric vehicle, the grid's going to collapse and we need to do lots of stuff. And in fairness, we do also sometimes see it as well, where we've been involved in some larger programs to deploy things like commercial vehicles, and there often are challenges to do with the grid. So it's obviously a big topic, but one that you're very deeply involved in. I just wondered if you could start to talk us through it in terms of what the key challenges are, what the strategy is, what's the plan in terms of the grid side to sort of adapt to this new electrified world that we've got coming.
Yeah, I absolutely. We hear the same things as well. There's always a few couple of points to get in there. People say, when everyone comes to electric vehicles, you'll have issues or problems. Yeah. The one thing I always kind of point out is that's going to be a process. It's suddenly you're not going to wake up tomorrow and electric cars, as much as we'd love that, electric cars not going to appear outside of everybody's house. So one of the key elements, and I talked about what I looked at before, was kind of planning. So can we see an uptake? So what are we expecting that trajectory and that uptake to look like? So having a good indication of when electric vehicles are going to come onto the system is absolutely crucial. And that, as you know, planning that's going to be key. Yeah. And that looks a little bit into what you talked about, kind of government. So what is government policy? So government policy can really drive this, or you can look at the kind of market, where is the technology going? So colleagues of mine in National Grid and other people across the industry will look at this and say, so the first thing, you've got this uptake of electric vehicles as well. So if you've got a good indication of where that uptake is, then you can kind of feed that into the kind of next layer. So other colleagues of mine they're far brighter again, and they're on the E part of the stem that we talked about there. They know what the grid looks like. So they know if you put lots of electric vehicles here, their models will say, actually, you need to do something here. So if I want to put a lot of electric vehicles, say in a town in 2025 and 2030, you will need to do this. So there's a kind of really robust planning process that sits behind it, and it's looking kind of 10 years ahead. Okay. So that's the kind of time frames that you're looking at here. And electric vehicles have been in the forecast as long as I've been working for National Grid. So people have been forecasting the uptake of electric vehicles for years and years and years. So that's the first thing to say. It's crucial you plan, because you need to know when these things are happening. You need to know what to do. On that what to do part, there's a few things that touched on. So it's different on kind of different parts of the grid. So I mentioned we're that element that takes it from power stations to the local grid. So if you go down into the local grid in your house, if you have an electric vehicle in your house, you can probably plug that in. And if you get a charge point installed, the charge point installer will do it. They should tell the local network operator that they've put an electric vehicle in your road, and they'll note that. And that kind of becomes part of their planning process. So again, it's the same as the national picture, and you can just kind of zoom that down. So you can say, actually, locally, if we see an uptake of electric vehicles in a particular area, you're going to have to do some work to upgrade particular areas. Now, that depends exactly on where you're going to be. As you can imagine, some parts of the grid, you could take lots of electric vehicles, other ones are just maybe a little bit tighter on demand because of other things. So remember, it's not just electric vehicles that use electricity. If you build a house, open a business, whatever you put into your house, if you just use a lot more electricity. So electric vehicles aren't some special class of electricity use. So you've got to combine that all together. So when you're looking at forecasts, you've got to combine everything together as well. And you've got to balance these things out. So you've got things that are pushing demand up, electric vehicles, maybe if you're looking at a heat pump as well, and then things that are going to pull it down. So are you seeing more energy efficiency? That's just stuff from light bulbs as well, just to more energy efficient homes as well. So you've got to balance the whole thing out. So again, you've got that kind of real local planning as well. And that will create time where you will need to do some work. So I think everyone's probably appreciative. You can't electrify all of transport and then kind of not have any upgrades to the grid. That would be a hugely impressive piece of work if you could. But there will be some pieces of work that will need to be done, some locally, and then as you go up, you kind of push that demand up, if you like, and say maybe there's some bigger upgrades go on. But it's kind of crucial to planning and where this is going. So it's crucial that we know where that uptake is, and for a local level that you have that visibility in. So if charge points installed, that people go through that right process just to inform companies, so you know where that demand's going to be. So there's processes and bits and pieces in place for that. In terms of the other side of it, so that's the more local saying, well, what if you want these kind of the big charging hubs? So what if you want lots of electric vehicles in one place, all kind of charging rapidly? So on motorway service areas, for example. So this gets you local. We know most people want to charge at home if they can. There are some people that can't. And there's also that category of people that want to go on those long journeys. You mainly do it once, twice a year. But I want to be able to drive my EV from London to Scotland. I don't want to go, oh, crikey, where am I going to do? Beforehand, I get my petrol car. I could drive to Scotland. I didn't think, is there going to be a petrol station on the way? I just knew there was going to be one. I didn't know precisely where. I didn't know who it was going to be, but I knew there was going to be one there. So it's about kind of getting that level of confidence up there. And this becomes a slightly different. So what you're talking about is kind of ultra rapid charging. So we're talking 150 kilowatts at the moment, maybe moving up to kind of 350 kilowatts when they're available. And you're talking potentially dozens of these all out together. So suddenly that becomes quite a substantial demand of power. When you compare that to the home, you've got quite a lot there. So this is a slightly different planning. So you kind of you've moved to the next notch of planning up.
5 or 10 megawatts for a big charge hub would not be that unusual, really, if it was sort of 10 or 12 high capacity chargers. Megawatts, which...
Yes, And once you kind of get larger to that, because if you are looking ahead into the future and you're looking to other forms of transport as well, so we talk about cars, vans, trucks, so suddenly you can see these hubs getting quite big quite quickly. And the one thing that kind of underpins the energy network is kind of being economic and efficient. So if you're going to upgrade the grid, you kind of want to do it as infrequently as you can. So if you go back to your house analogy quickly, what you don't want to do is say, if you've got an electric vehicle in, you don't want someone to come and dig up your road and do it. And then when your neighbour does it, you don't want that to happen again. And then when you hit a heat pump, you don't want someone to come in again. So it's what they call kind of touching the network once. So again, this goes back into the planning and knowing what's going in there. So basically, you can imagine you scaling that up. So you then say, okay, we've got large ones here. We're going to see these people applying through a process to need a connection to what could potentially be to the national grid. So actually now connecting to the larger transmission system, because the demand that they have is so large. You can do it to the local network as well. Again, it depends on what the local situation is. So that is a little bit more of a longer process. To get these connections takes a couple of years maybe. So that's where, again, you need to have thinking in advance where these things were going to be. So I think about this to make sure that you want to get it is making sure that the planning is in there and knowing about these things in advance and kind of looking to future-proof this as well. There's no good just looking at a couple of years ahead, because you'll never be able to catch up with demand for electric vehicles.
And how much of that do you think is currently, it's not even what you think, because you're doing it. So how much of that is happening today? If is there a sort of plan at National Grid that says, actually, next year we're going to have to deal with this amount of capacity for EVs, and then the year after, and by 2030 it's going to be a lot, and all that. Is that live now inside National Grid?
Yeah, so absolutely. So back to that kind of that rapid charging point, that is something we're kind of actively looking at the moment. You may be familiar with the government's OLEV, so the Office of Low Emissions Vehicles, Project Rapid. Okay. So this is looking to do that very thing, to put in rapid chargers at motorway service areas. So that's something we actively look at the moment, trying to work out what the kind of optimal connection solutions are to make sure we can deliver them in a timely manner. So they are looking to get these started by 2023. So 2023 sounds a long time away, but the timeframes you need to do significant energy infrastructure, it is a couple of years you're looking at. So you need to start thinking about that process now. And those sites, there's around 70 or so of those across the motorway network. So you multiply that up across, there's lots of pieces of work going on there as well. I can't talk for them, but for the distribution companies, there's lots of local work going on. So either more kind of local charging hubs, if you like, and also looking at that, what needs to be done literally in your street there. So that work is kind of ongoing. So if you ever see an electric vehicle van parked at the end of the road, digging out the road, they may be kind of reinforcing the local area so it can take increased demand as well. So that is kind of what's going on at the moment. And that's kind of part of the standard process. As I mentioned, once you have an electric vehicle, as exciting it is, if you strip it away, it is a demand for electricity. So that goes into your kind of standard process. And you say, demand's going to increase here. This will then cause a reinforcement to need to be built here, or a new substation to be built here. And that's where it then gets into the kind of the standard electricity piece of work, if that makes sense. And the electric vehicle element kind of gets lost and then gets put back on at the end there. But say most active is looking at this kind of rapid charging at motorway service area. So that is something that is new and is kind of being actively looked at the moment to be delivered by so get your first charges in for around 2023.
Yeah. And would it be the same thing for like truck distribution type operations, where you've got a lot of trucks or a lot of buses? If you're trying to run a lot of buses out of one place, that kind of thing.
I mean, you can take that model and you can kind of put it up to the next level. When you go look at trucks, there's not quite the equivalent of home chargers. I don't think truckers take their trucks home and park them in front of their cars, but
no, not normally.
There's kind of depot and there's kind of then fleet, isn't it? So you've got, where is your truck spending most of its time, and does it need to then just have maybe a slower charger? So if it's parked up overnight, can you maybe have a trickle charge for it as well, so it's ready to go in the morning? Or are there other opportunities where actually it's just parked there for half an hour while it unloads, or half an hour while the driver's on a break and then needs to move on? So this is when you need the rapid chargers, and technology is a little bit behind where it is for EVs as well there. But the kind of charges you'd be looking at there would be kind of around 1 megawatt. And if you do the calculation that we did earlier, suddenly you get significant areas of demand. So absolutely planning in that is required. And if you can tie them in with electric vehicles as well, then you kind of get this back to the touch the grid once kind of point as well. So if we can see where that demand's coming from, then you could build in kind of networks to kind of future-proof you, not only for cars, but potentially for trucks as well. But of course, there's a little bit of uncertainty on trucks about exactly what kind of pathway they're going down to. Could be hydrogen, could be electricity as well. How are you going to get that hydrogen? Are you producing it locally from electrolysis? So you actually still need electricity, or are you shipping it in from? So there's lots of kind of options there. So there's a little bit more uncertainty in that truck world, but absolutely you can use the same model there, and the same process would apply for other forms of transport, no problem.
Because you could then see, so things like Motorway Services, which at the moment probably don't have a very big demand for power because it's sort of lights and cooking equipment and sort of HVAC and stuff, like all of a sudden are going to become quite concentrated power consumers with megawatts, because let's say you want to put 5 fast chargers for trucks in and 30 for cars. That's going to be a huge grid demand, but in somewhere that was never really I don't think when the motorway services stations were being built in the 60s or whatever, it was being thought about in that way. So
I certainly don't think so, no. And that's kind of part where the government comes in and helps there. So you're absolutely right. So these tend to be quite isolated. They're beside the motorway service stations. There's generally not much around them as well. And you're right, the connections they have at the moment are relatively small. They just they can do lights and they can do cooking, as you suggested there. So if you want to get substantial upgrades there, you need to get substantial amount of power into that. And infrastructure costs money and it costs investment there. So you have a little bit of a kind of chicken and egg situation, if that's the way to describe it. So if you own that site saying, are you going to put charges into your motorway service area? You'll look at your studies and say, well, 2% of traffic is electric vehicles at the moment. I'm never going to make my money back on that investment. So maybe I'll put 1 or 2 in. And when you look at motorway service areas, you'll probably see 1 or 2 chargers around. Some have a few more. So he's thinking, well, how's that going to help the uptake of electric vehicles? If people don't see chargers when they go out on these long journeys, they're going to go, well, I'm not sure if I can commit to an EV. Maybe driving around locally is fine. So how do you kind of break that cycle? And this is what Project Rapid is to look to. So the other part of it is it comes with funding as well. So funding is to kind of break that cycle and say, actually, you can invest in that connection ahead of the need. So ahead of the electric vehicles, you can put in your charging infrastructure. So you have that there ready to go. So you build all your chargers, they're ready to go. People turn up, the handful of EV people, relatively speaking, that turn up go, brilliant, these new chargers have appeared. And they get to use it. Enough people go, oh, I see them. And then because you future-proof the capacity, you can add a couple more chargers on extra year as your expansion comes along, because you've got that capacity there because you've put that investment up front. And then you start to recoup the money from that investment for using the chargers, a bit like you would do any other investment there. So it's something that kind of breaks that kind of vicious cycle, if you want, and that's where the government can kind of step in and kind of stimulate the market. And we see this with new technology all the time. You have the EV grant, you have the plug-in grant. Again, for your renewables, you have support for that. So it's kind of relatively common for kind of starting new technology to get support like that.
So Project Rapid is a government-funded, government-supported project to where you guys are all kind of working together to try and put more rapid chargers in.
Yes.
Okay, I'll try and find some links to that, and I'll put something in the show notes about it if people are interested in finding out more about that project. So would it be fair to say that from your point of view, this is kind of the planning for all these different scenarios and working out what capacity upgrades need to be done and everything? That's kind of it sounds like that's just business as usual. This is you guys just going about your job.
Yep.
No one's kind of going, what do we do?
It's a very calm workplace. No, I don't think I've ever seen anybody do that as well. So I think the way in terms of that, the way sometimes it gets framed when people talk about it is you move to your kind of extreme scenario.
Yeah.
What if everyone had an electric car? What if everyone had an electric car tomorrow? And then they will plug them in and say all these kind of things. You're suddenly framing it as an absolute, I wouldn't even say worst case scenario, because that's an incredible scenario. That would never happen. We know from our experience of kind of electricity demand, there's natural diversification. So when people come home from work or get in from school or whenever, there's different things that you do. You may eat straight away, you may put television, you may do whatever you want to do. So you have that kind of diversity of demand that smooths it down. So you could equally place the argument, what if everyone comes home and plugs their EV? You could say, what if everyone comes home and turns their oven on?
Yeah.
We know they don't do that because from experience there. And from the experience of the trials that you have, people don't do that with electric vehicles as well. You could say, okay, the demand's higher, so you may have some issues there. But people generally will respond to signals as well. And people that sit between the electric vehicles and us, the kind of retailers, have kind of worked this out. There's an opportunity here to kind of encourage people to shift their demand.
Yeah.
It's of their benefit to get people to use electricity when it's cheap, traditionally overnight. You've had that for years, things like Economy 7, that trying to encourage demand to move at night. So if you can move electric vehicle charging at night, or maybe looking a little bit more forward, maybe aligning it with, say, when it's windy or when it's sunny, that makes perfect sense. And you don't really even have to do anything, because this will just be for an app, right? You'll set it up through the app, and that will set where you want to charge your vehicle as well. As long as you say, I just want it fully charged in the morning, how and when you do it, I'm not really fussed as well. And actually, it'll help reduce your energy bill as well, because it's going to find energy when it's cheapest as well. So suddenly you've got this idea of trying to spread out the demand, trying to smooth it down onto the system as well. And the way the market works, everyone's motivated to do that. So it kind of makes sense to anyone. So everyone should be kind of motivated to shift away from that peak time as well. And that's what you're seeing with kind of those innovative EV tariffs on the market at the moment.
Yeah, and that's something that is already electricity suppliers are already doing, isn't it, with this dynamic pricing? Yes. I think there's one or two, possibly two companies out there, even with negative pricing. I've seen that. So you're basically getting paid to charge to soak power off the grid at some times.
Yes, that's kind of amazing, isn't it? Getting paid to use electricity as well. So it just goes to show that if you can move your demand there, and there's excess, and these things will continue as you get more and more renewables onto the system. Those periods where those prices go very low, there will be more of them as well. So they kind of keep pace with the number of electric vehicles on the market as well.
And is that at the moment our demand for electricity is pretty lumpy, isn't it? It's sort of there's sort of peak periods through the day, and the difference between a peak demand time and a low demand time, it's a huge gap, isn't it, right now? Do you see much in that, in terms of trying to sort of make that demand more consistent, or is the whole thing actually, does it work better if there is a bigger gap? How does that work?
Again, not quite my area, but I think if you're managing the system, the easiest thing would be to have a constant flat demand, and then you build your power stations to meet that flat demand as well. So you kind of do want to minimize between peaks and troughs, but if you kind of flip that the other way, the reason you have that demand shape there is because that's how people kind of want to live their lives. They kind of tend to be asleep at night and demand is lower, and they tend to be doing lots of different things at peak time. So that's why you have the peak there as well. So at the moment, with what you do at the moment, it's very difficult to kind of shift that around. You can try and motivate people there, but people tend, if you've got children, you kind of tend to need to feed them. I know from experience at about the same time. If you say, no, kids, we've got to eat at 11 o'clock to try and flatten out the electricity demand, that's not going to fit there. But suddenly, if you put electric vehicles in there, that becomes a bit different, You just need that vehicle to be charged and ready to go in the morning. Are you really fussed when it charges up? So suddenly, when you add that kind of extra flexible demand in there, suddenly you can see that. So you can see that nighttime period starting to fill up, and potentially even you could see that peak coming down. So some people will even talk about vehicle to grid. So if you were very keen, you can have your battery going the other way into the grid. Of course, you'd be compensated for that because you're helping balance the system and supply energy there. So you could even see that situation where you have that peak and that trough difference really working out. And you put on top of that kind of the intelligence looking at what renewables are doing, then you see your demand pattern fit in the wind profile or the solar profile as well. So electric vehicles can only really help with that.
So my next question was going to be about local energy storage, and with vehicle to grid, you've kind of jumped to another one ahead there again. But do you think, we've had a number of podcasts recently where we're talking about battery storage on the grid and actually hydrogen storage to support the grid, and there was the sort of distribution level storage, so local storage to support stuff, but then some much bigger projects which are kind of tied to the generators for storage at that level. Do you see much of that kind of thing happening in the UK with storage coming onto the grid?
Yeah, well, there are storage projects already on the grid as well, and there are lots of applications for people to connect storage. Battery, of course, is the most popular at the moment, and you see them at all levels. So you see them you see them in people's homes. So you even go beyond that. You see people put in batteries in the home. Generally, if they've got solar as well. So there's that twinning really even at the local level. So if you've got generation that is variable or intermittent, you have that natural kind of need to try and twin it together because you want to use that energy when you need it. So you've got that kind of local element. Then absolutely you go onto the distribution level as well, and you see it even onto the transmission as well. So kind of real grid scale batteries, and we do see more of them twinning particularly with solar as well. So that's the most popular as well, because obviously solar obviously struggles to meet peak, because peak is winter and when it's dark as well. So that allows them to kind of operate into that market as well. Interestingly, on the other side, if you go to kind of offshore wind as well, it's interesting you mentioned hydrogen as well. So you are seeing people starting to think about that. Let's create twin hydrogen production, so a kind of form of energy storage by turning it into hydrogen, twinning that with offshore wind as well. So one situation, if you have large quantities of renewables, so a lot of people worry about, well, what if the wind's not blowing? So that's the discharge in your storage. But the other side of this, what if it really is blowing, but we don't need that demand? So imagine like a windy night at a weekend as well. So you don't have that level. What can we do with it? And the production of hydrogen seems a kind of natural solution to some people as well. So let's produce lots of hydrogen, and then we can use that for either heating or for transport that you can't electrify. So if you're talking fuel cells, or actually maybe even putting it into power stations and kind of burning cleanly there, if you want that kind of peak electricity demand. So absolutely, we've seen storage up and down the grid as well to either help balance it. I think more and more of it, you're going to see it from the kind of the energy storage point of view rather than the balancing of that. Of course, the big ones I should always mention, you would have large scale storage, you have pump storage already existing on the system, so you can see things operating like that really kind of help manage those peaks and troughs in the electricity system.
That was always it's like high school geography there. Pumps, just being.
Yes.
How many? Is there a couple of those in the UK? That's basically a reservoir where they pump water up to a reservoir and then release it. Is there one or two of those in the UK?
There are large ones. I think there are around 3 of them. So you're right in your the big one will be in Wales is Norway. That's one that often gets mentioned, but there are a couple in Scotland and a smaller scale projects as well. People are looking at that as well. So is it economically kind of viable? So if you do have this big swing in energy prices, could you even see more of those be built as well? But basically, it does exactly the same thing. So when there's lots of energy, it pumps the water up. And when it's low, it kind of pumps them back down again. So all these energy stories basically have the same principle. They need some differential between the energy price to make it viable, and renewables are kind of the thing that's kind of motivating the kind of that next boom, if you like in storage as well. So if you can then manage yourself, so this is the local one that you say, then that's beneficial to you. So you have a control of that. And then there's the grid one on top of that looks to kind of control the whole system as well. So there's those kind of tiers that you talk about.
I've come across a few people with larger energy consumption, and they've maybe as a company installed combined heat and power or solar systems, but then they're now starting to put battery storage in their factories or industrial sites to basically, so they don't have to sell, because effectively they don't get much money when they sell their surplus energy from their local renewable system onto the grid. So they're trying to keep that and use it themselves rather than having to buy energy in and pay for it. So that's there's this kind of like we're getting into renewables now, but there is this kind of panacea view of every house in the country has solar panels, has a bit of battery storage, and effectively is self-sufficient for power, so it doesn't really need the grid. And I think in some parts of California they've had a real problem because there's so much solar and particularly domestic solar that essentially it's almost like bankrupted the power companies and stuff, because there's all this solar about and people aren't buying the power, and it's causing lots of did cause lots of challenges. Do you see that as a in your kind of future scenario planning, is that more of that kind of thing in the UK, where you'll have isolated like local power generation, local consumption, and it doesn't ever really go outside of that? Is there going to be more of that, or do you not really see that as being a thing?
I think we can't. I'm going to be bold and say you're probably not going to see the California type situation just because of the different weather. But you saw a big boom in solar. It has slowed down a little bit in recent years, but you have seen that as well. So you certainly got to see smaller scale generation. So certainly as the technology improves and the cost of solar comes down and the cost of batteries come down, it is tempting to try and manage and be self-sufficient on there as well. The one thing that we always note there, that maybe not for everyone, and maybe not practical for everybody to do in terms of costs or accessibility, or whether you're a vulnerable customer, for example. So there is that kind of wider point to think about as well, that if you have that as well, if you took your house totally off grid as well, then it's great for your self-sufficient. But did you want that opportunity to maybe trade that energy with somebody else? And that's got to go through a network to somebody else as well. So I think we kind of see that as a slight kind of reshaping about what the national grid does, of moving it from maybe not from so much from large power stations down to homes, but maybe shifting it from home to home if those homes are on the other side of the country as well there, and then more on those demand opportunities as well. So more on transport and more on heat as well. So a little slight rebalance. So you can see kind of more demand lower down the system, more generation down on the system as well. But there will still be those occasions where you need to move energy from one part of the country to the other. So imagine it's sunny in the south or windy in the north, and you kind of want to shift this. I know. I just pluck that idea out of of course, could be the other way around.
I'm already reeling from your suggestion that it's sunnier in California than it is in the UK.
And it's about that kind of that transfer of energy as well. So I think you still need the idea that everybody could become self-sufficient. I don't quite get. I think there are some people who could do that, or some people that could be sufficient 80-90% of the time, and then you have the grid there for that remainder part of time. Of course, that does kind of raise questions about if you're using the grid less, how what's the best way to pay for that, and what's the best way to manage that as well. And that's a big discussion to have. That's one for governments and kind of regulators to work out who ends up paying for infrastructure as well. So that's a big question that you have as well. So if you're building infrastructure for electric vehicles, who should end up paying for that bill? Is it the individual? Is it taxpayers? Is it bill payers as well? So you end up in that kind of discussion, however you kind of look at this.
Yeah, it's good, and it's interesting because the solar was really getting some pace, and then obviously the sort of subsidies and stuff changed for it. So like residential solar's kind of slowed down now quite a lot, but I'm hearing a lot people talking about it coming back, and particularly for industrial, so like being sort of campaigns to retrofit factories and stuff with solar, which is seems to make a lot of sense, got a lot of roof space. But then the big new renewable energy, really, because of the cost of it, has been offshore wind, particularly for us, and that is, it's like, well, it's a big power station effectively, although it's sort of a bit more spread out and in the water. How does the National Grid have to? How do you deal with that?
That feels like that could have been an entirely different new podcast on that. You're right. That is a really big challenge. So the fall in price for offshore wind has been kind of quite amazing. I think even five years ago people wouldn't have predicted that as well. And of course, in this country, we're blessed with wind in terms of, especially in the North Sea as well. So what that does, you concentrate all your wind kind of in the North Sea into the kind of north of the country as well. So what you need to do, the challenge is getting that all onshore and then back into the grid as well. Of course, you mentioned lots of these ones together, then they need to be potentially joined up, some kind of coordination of getting them onshore as well. So there are some big challenges there, and there was a recent announcement by the government of an ambition of 40 gigawatts of wind by 2030. So for a benchmark there, we have around 10 gigawatts on the system as well. So that's a quadrupling of what you have on the system at the moment, and the kind of offshore winds that you're looking at. So these are not the kind of ones where you turn up on the beach and you can almost touch the wind turbine. These ones are miles and miles outshot, and these are absolutely phenomenally tall structures as well there, where it's almost perpetually windy there. So you're absolutely maximising the effect there. And of course, the challenges of then getting that energy to shore are quite immense. So there is a lot of work that needs to happen there on renewable energy. And I'm sure you could have a whole separate podcast talking about renewable energy and offshore wind in particular. That would be a good topic.
From National Grid's point of view, I'm guessing you don't get involved in putting the cables into the sea. That would be the responsibility of the whoever's building the wind farm to.
So without getting too much into so when currently, and this is the current regime, and regimes come and go, of course. If you wanted to build an offshore wind farm, you'd basically build it to the shore.
Okay.
That would be what you'd need to build, and then you'd get a connection
okay.
onto there. So there's so in between where the national grid finishes at the beach, if you like, then there is another. It's still kind of classified as transmission, but it's a separate kind of offshore transmission to take it then to the wind farm. So that's a kind of separate piece which is owned by a separate business there, but they're kind of built in one unit. So you build your wind farms and then you build your connection basically at the same time. Yep. So no, we don't have people wading out to see, unfortunately. But again, people are thinking about that whole regime. Does that make sense about connecting each individual wind farm on, or do you have a little bit more of a kind of coordinated effect? Could you even maybe see them being coordinated with other European countries as well? So you could even imagine some kind of big mesh of a North Sea grid as well. Whether that's a reality, because that's lots of parties to get involved, but these are the things that are being talked about at the moment as solving these problems.
Well, European politics always, dead simple always works. Actually, up here in where we are based in the north of England, we do have a high power interconnector that goes out. Does it go to Norway? So in Blythe, where the old power station was, there's a high voltage DC, I think, connection point. And it always sort of struck me, I don't know, that kind of thing, just mentioned it there in the context of wind, but do you see that sort of trading country to country as being something there's going to be more of in the future, or?
I think so. I think, Norway, you mentioned, gets a connection. So there are a couple of connections to Norway, certainly under construction or being thought about. So obviously closer neighbours, France, Belgium, Holland and Denmark are your obvious ones. And then, of course, on the west coast towards the Republic of Ireland and to Northern Ireland as well. So absolutely there is an uptake in interconnection precisely for kind of what you said. So if you have lots of renewable power, then maybe if you can't take that within countries, so if we can't charge up our electric vehicles and we can't shift our demand, maybe we could sell that excess power. So let's use Norway as an example. Say Norway was really windy at the moment. Norway, it wouldn't happen. You wouldn't say Norway, but Norway buys power. Say, we'll have the power there. Do you know what we'll do is we'll not use our hydro power. So they'll turn off their hydro plants and they'll use our wind. Yeah. And when the wind dies down, we'll go. And Norway will go, we got a lot of hydro because we didn't use our hydro yesterday because thanks to your wind. Do you want some of our hydro back? And we'll say, thank you very much. Yeah. It's not quite that cordial how it works, but that's the kind of idea. And the more countries you have connected, the more options that you have. So there's a wind hydro. You could maybe have wind, solar. It's got to be sunny in France and not sunny in the UK, for example. So maybe you could have that. Or vice versa, sunny in the UK and not sunny in France. But that's the kind of idea. And the more, and then they're connected to somebody else. So suddenly you can create chains here. So you could almost say, well, maybe nothing's happening. It's not windy and it's not sunny in France, but maybe it's really sunny in Germany. And then you could run that through like that. So the more interconnection you get, the more options you've got of balancing and trading that energy as well. So that's why people look at interconnection there. So it increases your kind of diversity there as well. So if you've got a lot of wind or a lot of solar, the more people you can trade that with, the more efficient that market's going to become. Yeah,
because it feels like, particularly where the costs have gone to now, obviously wind, like you said, the decrease in cost of wind generation has been massive the last few years. But then actually solar, I was reading something a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about some of the big solar projects, actually not what we said, not in the UK, but in Northern Africa and some parts of Southern Europe. And they were reporting exceptionally low solar costs now as well. So you do kind of see, well, the point of both of those was that the cost of either wind or solar was actually less than, any other form of generation. So, the downside obviously is that it doesn't always blow and it's not always sunny, but if you can get that sort of trading and some storage built into it, then from a purely economic point of view, it feels like we've got very cheap and clean energy coming because these things are, they're there now. That you don't. It's not going to take massive subsidies or huge sort of government programs. Actually, private companies can put capital into building these things. So
yeah,
I guess in your kind of scenario planning that there must be a big allowance for lots of new renewable stuff coming onto the grid in the next few years.
Absolutely. Same when we started our conversation about, you can see EV planning, you can see the uptake of renewables there as well. So you're planning in offshore wind, you're planning in solar as well, and you're planning in the interconnectors as well. So there are teams that kind of look at kind of Europe-wide modelling as well. So what's happening in Europe, kind of modelling that. So where's the power going to come from? So if there are big solar projects in southern Europe, as you say, or big wind projects in kind of northern Europe as well. So trying to factor that in for a whole European market to see what energy flows are going to look like as well. So yeah, absolutely picking up on those kind of cheap renewables where it is. And so obviously we're blessed with wind here in this country as well. So you'll see the price of offshore wind go down. So if you're in a very sunny climate, so the Sahara, North Africa, Southern Europe, you're going to see those solar prices drive down, and you will see that kind of filter through as well. So you mentioned you're going to see solar back on roof. So if the cost of the panel itself starts to get driven down, people will buy them subsidy free because they won't need it. The calculation and the energy savings will make sense, and people that will then build solar plants just as you would build a conventional plant, just for the conventional economics as well. So all these investments going on around the world are going to drive your prices of wind. So if we put in more offshore wind, we're driving that price down, then it becomes, say, economically viable in other parts of the world. So this is a kind of big global market that suddenly we found ourselves in, with everyone's kind of driving the price of these technologies down, whereas you're looking at conventional generation that's already had those price reductions. It's really difficult to get conventional plants, if you like, kind of fossil fuel plants, any cheaper because they've had all those learnings built in, so they're already out there.
If anything, they're getting more expensive as it gets more costly to deal with the emissions and carbon trading, and
absolutely as well. You have the variability of the fuel price, and say if you have carbon and carbon trade, if you want to fully factor in the price of carbon, then that's the cost that you've got to add in as well. So I absolutely as well. So if you're looking for price kind of certainty as well, maybe renewables are the way to go there. If you want to kind of course, you swap one variability in the weather for another one, but is that something that you can maybe manage a bit easier?
Manage that, and that, because the other, like, if headline big criticisms thrown at the EV contingent is well, you plug in your car in and you're making your electricity with a dirty coal-fired power station, and therefore the CO2 is no better than a normal car. But I guess from the conversation we've just had, that it would be fairly safe to say that we'll actually see probably the generation side of the grid decarbonise maybe more quickly than the anticipated uptake in EVs. Do you think that would be fair?
I would say absolutely. So I can speak for the UK. In different parts of the world, there are different generation uses. But if we look at the UK, then absolutely the coal generation has fallen drastically in the last 10 years or so from then when it was the dominant form of generation. So now there's a handful of plants that are kind of almost peaking plants. Now they're reverted back to them, and you see the increase of wind and solar there. So if you had an electric vehicle for 10 years, so if you were an early adopter of a Leaf, say for example, your car has got cleaner and cleaner and cleaner over the lifetime that you've had it. Whereas you can't say that for a conventional vehicle. I can maybe plug a National Grid app there. I'm more just happy, Ryan, to send you the details if you want to share it with your,
that would be great,
your listeners. That actually lets you kind of track the carbon intensity, so you can see at any point in time what the carbon intensity is, and it gives you little tips about when to plug things in and when not to plug things in. If you look behind that, it'll point you to a history, and you can see year on year that carbon intensity. So how much carbon goes into the electricity you generate, kind of falling year on year on year as well. So the argument that may have held true maybe 10, 15 years ago to have coal plants, but in the UK that's not a true thing to say. I'm trying to think of my diplomatic language to say there at the moment. I'm sure it's a falsehood as well, but it maybe was true some time ago, but certainly it's not true now. And you can be clever when you charge your electric vehicle up, so you can even get it even cleaner by choosing that times when it is there, and you can have the comfort that over the lifetime of your electric vehicle, it's going to get even cleaner as well. So that's a fantastic thing to think about it when if you've got friends out there are sure, should I buy an electric vehicle because they've heard those stories? Show them this app, and then you can misbuff those things straight away.
Great, yeah. So I'll put a link to the app in the show notes, so we can share that with people. Next question. You were just trying to be diplomatic there, and I'm not. Apologies, because I know this can be a bit of a sore subject. Quite a few issues in the UK nuclear industry at the moment, or in fact the global nuclear industry, with I think people sort of reassessing investments in nuclear. Have you got a view on that? I don't know, like from National Grid or from a personal point of view, do you think nuclear is going to kind of still be part of the mix, or is it just too expensive?
I suppose from a National Grid point of view, if power stations come along and want to be kept into the grid, then we're obliged to get them as well. So there's obviously Hinkley Point C is kind of under construction at the moment, and you expect that to come online in the next couple of years. You have your existing fleet as well, and I think we're going to see those on the system depending on their age for the next 5, 10, or even longer. This nuclear is going to be part of the mix out. I don't think anyone's seriously saying, well, we should close nuclear plants down. In terms of that, government seems quite keen on them, and I think this comes to wanting a diversity in generation mix. They would worry about moving too much towards one form of energy. Same way you wouldn't want just nuclear, you wouldn't want just coal, or you wouldn't want just wind. So within government, there's a liking of having diversity as well. So something to fall back on if it's not windy, they can see that logic. There's in terms of costs there, I mean, that ultimately economics will drive this thing. If one form of generation is cheaper than another, then it will run up as well. And if you can build a form of generation without government support, then if I'm a government or I'm a regulator on that part, that's a very difficult story to kind of say, well, actually, I'm going to support one form of industry, whilst another one here that can go on its own. So I think it will remain part of the mix just because of what you've got on the system and the plant under construction as well. I mean, it's challenging for a lot of conventional. We could have that argument for gas as well. Could you build a gas power station as well at the moment? My economics would be really challenging to build that at the moment. And could I pick up a subsidy to build a gas power station? I would probably really struggle with that. So I think ultimately, like a lot of these things, it will kind of be economics that will determine that. And once people get confidence that the energy mix that they have is resilient and reliable and cheap and low carbon, that's ultimately where you're looking to go there as well. So whether nuclear remains part of the mix in the long term, not too sure, but certainly in the medium term, it's going to be part of the mix there.
Yeah. I guess it back to the cost again of, I think off the top of my head, the wind, the sort of the new pricing for wind is like half the cost of the recent sort of nuclear schemes that are coming in. So just the simple economics of it. Although, it's interesting. So there's a lot of stuff there, but basically, so the initial question being,
where did we get with that?
Well, we started with the suggestion that people always say the grid's going to fall over if we have a mass adoption of electric cars. But I think what should be really clear to people is that National Grid has this more than on its radar and is doing an awful lot of work to plan for different scenarios and making big investments in upgrading the grid to deal with this new future that's coming with EVs and renewables and other things. It's kind of not quite nothing to see here, but it's being managed. We're not going to get any blackouts anytime soon because of electric vehicles.
Certainly not. No, I think that's the one thing to think about it as well. That I don't want to downplay and say, it's a bit boring and it's a bit business as usual. But when you have the system that is designed to do that, it's designed to take new forms of demand and new forms of generation in the time. So that's not to say that you don't need to do any investment. That tells you where the investment needs to do, what that investment looks like, and what kind of timeframes you have around that investment. So there's a different thing to the grid can cope. You don't have to do any investment. The grid can cope because it has this planning and strategy and scenarios that are going around it. Absolutely, there will need to be investment. Again, you can put that down to the local network. There will need to be local investment and national investment as well. I think everyone's aware of that. You can't you can't move from kind of fossil fuels to electric vehicles and kind of expect that no investment will be required. It's about a matter of targeting that right place, understanding exactly what that needs to happen, and making sure it happens in the right time. So it's all good planning, unfortunately. So it's if you like planning and kind of project management and scenarios, it's kind of your world, but it's maybe not as exciting as some people make out, unfortunately.
Yeah, I can see why the mathematician is very happy in this environment.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, no, that's been absolutely fascinating, Russell. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
No. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and hope your listeners enjoyed that as well, and enjoy the links as well to Project Rapid and to that app, so they can kind of see what the carbon intensity is doing at any one time. So you do get a little addicted to it. Just you find yourself just looking at it all the time. So just a little word of warning there.
I'm definitely going to be putting that on my phone. I hadn't, I am a bit of a geek, and I do normally have I've got some very strange apps on my phone for monitoring things, but I hadn't come across that one. So that is that's definitely going to be one I'm going to get, because we've got two electric cars in our house, and we are sort of careful about when we plug them in. So it'd be really helpful to have that information real time coming to us. So that'd be really interesting. So thanks again for joining us. Thank you to everyone who's listening for taking the time out to listen to the show today. I hope you've got something valuable from that. Don't forget to leave us a rating, comment, hit like, subscribe, depending on what platform you're listening on. We're going out on, I think, 7 or 8 different platforms now, from iTunes, Apple Podcasts, right through to YouTube. No video on YouTube, it's just the audio, but some people like looking at us there. We get quite a lot of comments through the YouTube platform as well. If you've got any questions that you'd like us to pick up in the future and make an episode about, don't forget to send those in as well. And if you're working in the EV space and you're doing something really cool, get in touch, and you could be on a podcast just like Russell as well. So that's all we've got time for today. I really look forward to speaking to you again soon.